Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a piece of source material that is honestly just incredibly powerful to read. We're looking at first-hand testimony written by Dr. Diaz, titled "They Raped My Innocence and Called It Normal." Now, right off the bat, I need to point out that this isn't just someone recounting personal trauma. Diaz actually frames this entire piece as a formal indictment, a charge against an entire civic culture. We're going to break down the severe institutional failures he describes and trace exactly how an environment can systemically just completely abandon a vulnerable kid. To really grasp what's happening here, you have to put yourself in the survivor's shoes. What Diaz is outlining isn't just a story about the horrific acts of childhood abuse itself. It's really a story about the profound, deafening silence that came after it. It's about this massive breakdown where the systems that were literally built to protect children, well, they just looked away. They completely ignored the victim. And ultimately, as Diaz points out, they blamed him instead. Okay, let's dive into this first section, the unspoken charge and the debt of a nation. We really need to establish the context of Diaz's family background here, because it's absolutely crucial to understanding the sheer weight of his indictment. He's the son of a Dominican mother who was working constantly just to keep the family afloat, and a Puerto Rican father who had been drafted by the U.S. military. His dad literally gave his body to the military and came back 100% disabled. So here is the grim, undeniable irony that Diaz presents. The country demanded his father's health, right? They demanded his physical sacrifice through the draft. But then the city of Milwaukee completely failed to extend even a basic duty of care to his young, incredibly vulnerable son left at home. Moving on to the next part, a child without language, navigating the unspeakable. So that massive civic failure we just talked about, it trickled all the way down to the micro level, to the daily lived reality of a little boy. At this point, Diaz was only in first, second, or third grade, and he just didn't have the vocabulary to articulate the trauma he was living through. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it visually maps the exact anatomy of a child's entrapment. It was this vicious sequence. First, he was targeted by older, more powerful peers. He was molested by an next-door neighbor, targeted by another boy and his brothers, bullied, beaten, just relentless. Second, because he had no words for this, he was completely frozen by fear. Third, the adults who absolutely should have been watching and intervening were nowhere to be found, or they just didn't care. And fourth, the final blow. The message he got from every administrator and teacher was basically, "This is your fault." He was blamed as the victim. Which brings us to Section 3, Failures in the Classroom. To truly wrap our heads around how deep this systemic apathy ran, we kind of have to move away from the neighborhood threats for a second and look at a specifically documented institutional failure inside the school system itself. Diaz shares this completely horrifying incident from when he was in kindergarten. A teacher literally left physical welts on his body. So his disabled veteran father, a man who had already sacrificed so much for his country, goes directly to the school administration to report the abuse. And the result? Nothing. Zero. The administration took absolutely no disciplinary action against the teacher. They basically just made the problem disappear. And this brilliantly illustrates one of the core themes of Diaz's testimony. The only justice available to this Latino family in Milwaukee was the justice of running away. They literally had to pull him out of the school just to physically keep him safe. Let's look at Section 4, Weaponization of Silence and how vulnerability is exploited. Because the adults and the institutions made it crystal clear they weren't going to step in, it created an environment that was just ripe for exploitation. The abusers started using a really chilling tactic against him. Diaz points out that the cruelty he faced wasn't just random kids acting out, it was actually highly organized. The older kids figured out very quickly exactly what paralyzed him. They used this exact threat against him. "If you don't do what I say, I'll say you did it anyway." I mean, imagine that being used against a little boy who didn't know how to fight back and had absolutely no adult in his corner to turn to. This brings us to a really critical concept in his testimony. The trauma wasn't just the physical violence. It was the intense psychological manipulation. These abusers were actively weaponizing his silence. They were breaking a child by exploiting his fear and his sheer inability to articulate what was happening to him. And crucially, they were counting entirely on the absence of intervening adults. They knew the system didn't care about him, right? And they leveraged that apathy as a weapon. And that brings us to the final section, an indictment of Milwaukee and its civic culture. Let's zoom out for a second from the child's specific experience to the macro level, because this is where everything builds toward the author's ultimate verdict. Diaz uses this piercing, unforgettable description to characterize the city of Milwaukee where he grew up. He calls it Sodom and Gomorrah with a Midwestern accent. He uses this phrase to sharply contrast the really grim, completely unprotected reality of what he actually survived against the city's wholesome, sort of community-driven self-image.
So the crucial point is captured right here in this massive hypocrisy. Diaz notes that Milwaukee presents itself to the world as this city of community, faith, and working-class values. He points out there's a bar on virtually every corner and a church or religious storefront on every other block. It's this massive performance of virtue. But the actual practice of virtue? Yet, that was nowhere to be found. Instead, the reality for this little Puerto Rican boy was a culture of entitlement, of cruelty, and of total indifference to a minority child who desperately needed someone to stand up and say, hey, this is wrong and we're going to stop it.
Diaz states explicitly that he is not writing this testimony to get sympathy. That's not the point. He's writing it as a formal indictment of the entities that failed him. As you can see, it's this widening net of systemic breakdown. First, the school administration that ignored his welts, then the neighborhood that exploited his silence, and finally, the broader city of Milwaukee, whose civic culture just allowed all of this to happen in broad daylight. Which leaves us with the core thesis of his testimony, and honestly, a thought I want to leave you with today. Diaz's father gave everything to a country that drafted him and returned him broken, yet the city gave absolutely nothing back to protect his son. When a city, or a society for that matter, takes so heavily from a family, what duty of care does it owe the vulnerable children left behind? It's a profound question about systemic accountability, institutional apathy, and what community is actually supposed to mean. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this incredibly important explainer today.